The dinner table was set for two, the wine breathing in the decanter, but the silence in the penthouse was loud enough to fracture the glass. It wasn't the lipstick stain on the collar that had betrayed her, but the way she looked through him, as if he were already a ghost haunting his own marriage. When the luggage appeared in the hallway, packed not for a vacation but for an exile, the brutal truth didn't need to be spoken, only survived. If you find yourself drawn to the quiet, devastating moments where love turns into a cold war, stay with me as we unravel the wreckage. The sound of the key turning in the lock was the loudest thing in the hallway. It was a heavy, distinct click that usually signaled safety, the end of a long day, the transition from the chaotic noise of Manhattan to the curated silence of home. But tonight, the silence waiting for Ethan on the other side of the door felt different. It felt heavy, pressurized. Ethan Caldwell pushed the door open, shaking the October rain from his coat. He was tired. The pitch meeting for the Hudson Yards project had been a disaster. Another client who wanted visionary work on a pragmatic budget. He had spent the subway ride home rehearsing how he would tell Elena that the commission might not come through, that money would be tight for another month. He hated the look she gave him when he talked about money, a mixture of pity and exhaustion that cut deeper than any shouting match. "Elena," he called out, his voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged foyer. She didn't answer. He walked into the living room, and the first thing he saw was the suitcase. It was his suitcase. The battered leather weekender he'd had since college, standing upright in the center of the Persian rug like a tombstone. Next to it were two cardboard boxes, taped shut with aggressive precision. Ethan stopped. His breath hitched in his chest, a cold knot forming in his stomach that had nothing to do with the damp chill of the evening. Elena was sitting in the wingback chair by the window, a silhouette against the glowing skyline of the city. She held a glass of red wine, her posture rigid, her legs crossed. She didn't look at him. She was looking at the reflection of the room in the glass, watching him enter through the dark mirror of the window pane. "What is this?" Ethan asked. His voice was steady, but his hands felt numb. "We need to talk, Ethan," she said. Her voice was calm, terrifyingly calm. It was the voice she used for crisis management calls with her PR clients, detached, efficient, solution-oriented. She finally turned to face him. Her face was perfectly made up, not a smudge of mascara, not a hint of a tear. She looked beautiful, and she looked like a stranger. "I can't do this anymore," she said, taking a sip of wine. "The waiting, the potential. I'm 32 years old, Ethan. I'm tired of waiting for your big break. I'm tired of paying the rent on a life you can't afford." Ethan loosened his tie, feeling like the room was shrinking. "Elena, it's just a rough patch. The Hudson Yards meeting—" "It's not about the meeting," she interrupted, cutting him off with a slice of her hand. "It's about reality. And the reality is, I've met someone who lives in reality." The air left the room. Ethan stared at her. "What?" "Marcus," she said, "just the name." She didn't need to explain. Marcus Sterling, the developer. The man Ethan had introduced her to at a gala 6 months ago. The man whose suit cost more than Ethan's car. The man Ethan had thought was a mentor. "Marcus," Ethan repeated, the name tasting like ash. "You're sleeping with Marcus?" Elena didn't flinch. She didn't look ashamed. If anything, she looked relieved. "He understands ambition, Ethan. He understands that love isn't enough to sustain a lifestyle. We've been seeing each other for 3 months. 3 months. Ethan did the math in his head. The late nights at the office, the weekend conferences, the new lingerie he found in the laundry but never saw her wear. The clues had been there, scattered like breadcrumbs. He was too stupid to follow. "So that's it?" Ethan asked, a bitter laugh escaping his throat. "You packed my bags? You're kicking me out?" "This apartment is in my name, Ethan," she said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming steel. "My parents put down the deposit. I pay the mortgage. You know that." "We're married," he whispered. "And I'll be filing the papers on Monday," she replied. She set the wine glass down on the coaster. "Marcus is coming over in an hour. I want you gone before he gets here. It would be uncomfortable." The cruelty of it took his breath away. It wasn't the infidelity that crushed him in that moment. It was the logistics. She had scheduled his eviction to align with her lover's arrival. She had managed the timeline of their marriage ending like a corporate merger. Ethan looked at the boxes, his books, his drafting tools, his clothes, his entire life reduced to 3 parcels on the floor. He looked at her. He wanted to scream. He wanted to throw the wine glass against the wall. He wanted to fall to his knees and beg. But as he looked at her cold, expectant eyes, he realized she wanted him to make a scene. She wanted him to be the emotional wreck so she could be the rational victim. She wanted a story to tell Marcus later. How pathetic Ethan had been. How right she was to leave him. He wouldn't give her that. Ethan straightened his spine. The numbness spread, turning him cold, shutting down the panic. He walked over to the table where he had left his keys. "You packed everything?" he asked. "The essentials," she said. "I'll have the rest sent to your sister's place." "Don't bother," Ethan said. He picked up the suitcase. It was heavy. "Ethan," she said, her voice softening just a fraction, a performative grace note. "I am sorry, I deserve more." Ethan paused at the door. He didn't look back at her. He looked at the apartment, the crown molding he had restored himself, the lighting fixtures he had designed, the home he had tried to build for them, and it was just drywall and glass now. "You deserve exactly what you're getting, Elena," he said quietly. He opened the door and walked out. He didn't slam it. He closed it with a soft, definitive click. Outside, the rain had turned into a deluge. The wind whipped down the avenue, biting through his coat. Ethan stood on the sidewalk, the water soaking through his shoes, looking up at the window of the 3rd floor. He saw the warm glow of the lamp, and then he saw her silhouette move away, preparing the stage for Marcus. He gripped the handle of his suitcase until his knuckles turned white. He had nowhere to go. His bank account was overdrawn. His heart was a crater. He turned his back on the building and began to walk toward the subway station. The city of New York towered over him, indifferent and massive, a billion lights shining on a billion secrets. He was just another piece of debris washed into the gutter. But as the cold rain ran down his neck, Ethan felt something strange rising beneath the grief. It was a cold, hard resolve, a foundation being poured. "I will not just survive this," he thought, the rhythm of his footsteps matching the pounding of his heart. "I will own this." He vanished into the dark mouth of the subway entrance, leaving Ethan the husband behind, and stepping onto the train as a man with nothing left to lose. The morning light filtering through Mark's blinds was gray and unforgiving. Ethan woke up with a crick in his neck and the taste of stale bourbon in his mouth. He was lying on a sofa that was too short for him, in an apartment that smelled of bachelorhood and neglect. For a few seconds in the haze of waking, he forgot. He reached out his hand, expecting to feel the high thread count sheets of his bed, expecting the smell of Elena's expensive jasmine shampoo. Instead, his hand hit the rough fabric of a throw pillow. Then the memory of the rain, the suitcase, and the door clicking shut crashed back into him. He sat up, rubbing his face. Mark was already in the kitchen, the coffee machine gurgling. Mark had been Ethan's friend since architecture school, a guy who usually had his back. But the air in the room felt tight. "Coffee's ready," Mark said, not turning around. He was scrolling through his phone with a thumb that moved too quickly. "Thanks for letting me crash," Ethan said, his voice raspy. "I'll find a place today. Maybe a hotel." Mark finally turned. He looked tired, and worse, he looked guilty. "Yeah, about that, Elena called me this morning." Ethan froze. "She called you?" "She was worried," Mark said, but he wouldn't meet Ethan's eyes. "She said you were spiraling, said you've been under a lot of pressure with the job, that you weren't yourself. She made it sound like this was a mental health thing." Ethan felt a cold laugh bubbling up in his chest. It was brilliant. It was tactical. Elena wasn't just kicking him out, she was controlling the spin. If Ethan was unstable, then her affair wasn't a betrayal. It was a coping mechanism. She was the long-suffering wife dealing with a failing, erratic husband. "She's sleeping with Marcus Sterling, Mark," Ethan said quietly. Mark shifted uncomfortably. "Look, man, I don't know the details. I just know she's a partner at the PR firm that handles my company's account. If I get in the middle of this—" He trailed off, the implication hanging in the air like smoke. Ethan stood up. He understood. Loyalty in this city had a price tag, and Ethan couldn't afford it anymore. He was a liability. Don't worry, Ethan said, walking past the coffee. I'm leaving. He grabbed his suitcase and walked out before Mark could offer a weak apology. New York City was loud, indifferent, and expensive. Ethan sat in a diner on 8th Avenue, nursing a black coffee he couldn't pay for with a credit card that might already be canceled. He stared at his phone. Notifications were piling up. Texts from mutual friends asking if he was okay. Messages that dripped with condescending pity. Elena had won the social war before he even knew a battle had started. He opened his email. Buried under the rejection notices from local firms was a thread he had ignored 2 weeks ago. It was from a recruiter for a development group based in Dubai. Subject: Lead Architect, Project Mirage. Immediate deployment. High risk, high reward. The job was a grinder. It was building luxury compounds in the middle of the desert. 14-hour days, isolation, heat, and a non-disclosure agreement so thick it could stop a bullet. It was the kind of job people took when they wanted to make money and forget who they were. Ethan hit reply. I'll take it. When can I fly? The response came within 3 minutes. Tonight, JFK. One-way ticket provided upon signature. Ethan didn't hesitate. He signed the digital contract on his cracked phone screen. 6 hours later, he stood in the international terminal of JFK. The airport was a liminal space, neither here nor there, a perfect purgatory for a man ghosting his own life. He had sold his watch at a pawn shop to pay for the cab. He had no apartment, no wife, no friends. He looked at his phone one last time. A new text from Elena popped up. Where are you? We need to discuss the divorce papers. Don't be childish, Ethan. He looked at the message, reading the words of a woman who thought she still owned him. She expected him to fight, to beg, to stay in her orbit as a failed satellite. Ethan walked over to a trash can near the boarding gate. He didn't just turn the phone off. He popped the back case open, dug his thumbnail into the slot, and pulled out the SIM card. It was a tiny piece of plastic that contained his entire history. The photos, the messages, the contacts, the tether to New York. He dropped the SIM card into the trash. It fell among the half-eaten sandwiches and empty coffee cups. He dropped the phone in after it. Final boarding call for flight 802 to Dubai, the intercom announced. Ethan Caldwell adjusted his coat. He picked up his battered leather bag. He didn't look back at the city skyline visible through the terminal windows. He walked down the jet bridge, stepping into the tube that would fire him across the world, leaving the ruins behind to build something harder, sharper, and unbreakable. 6 months had passed, and the apartment on the Upper West Side no longer smelled like old books and cedar. It smelled of eucalyptus and expensive, unidentifiable leather. Elena stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the bedroom, adjusting the strap of her emerald silk gown. It was a dress Marcus had bought for her, stunning, backless, and a size smaller than she usually wore. Motivation, he had called it with a charming wink. She hadn't eaten a carb in 3 weeks. The reflection staring back was perfect. She was the woman she had always wanted to be, draped in designer silk, attending the Met Gala prep dinner, living with one of the most powerful developers in Manhattan. But beneath the layers of foundation, her eyes looked tired. There was a tightness around her mouth that hadn't been there when she was married to Ethan. Elena, are you ready? The car is idling. Marcus's voice drifted from the living room, impatient and smooth. He didn't come to the door to check on her. He expected her to appear. Coming, she called out, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She walked out into the living room. The space had been gutted. Ethan's restoration work, the crown moldings he had sanded by hand, the warm oak bookshelves he had built, was gone. In its place was stark, industrial minimalism. Steel, glass, and white marble. It looked like a museum lobby, cold and impressive. Marcus stood by the window, typing on his phone. He didn't look up as she entered. He was a handsome man, silver fox gray at the temples, wearing a tuxedo with the ease of a man who wore them as often as pajamas. Do I look okay? Elena asked, a rare note of insecurity leaking into her voice. Marcus finally glanced up. His eyes swept over her, not with affection, but with the critical appraisal of an art dealer inspecting an acquisition. Turn around, he said. She turned. The strap is twisted, he noted, walking over. His fingers were cold against her skin as he fixed the silk. Better. You need to charm the senator's wife tonight, Elena. We need the zoning permits for the Brooklyn project. Don't bore her with PR strategy details. Just listen. Be engaging. Be a decoration, he meant. I can handle the senator's wife, Elena said, pulling away slightly. I run a firm, Marcus. I know how to talk to people. Of course you do, darling, he said dismissively, checking his watch. But tonight is about my work. Let's go. The dinner was a blur of crystal glasses and polite, shark-like conversation. Elena sat to Marcus's left, smiling until her cheeks ached. She watched him charm the table, telling stories she had heard a dozen times, positioning himself as the visionary of the city. Halfway through the main course, the conversation turned to architecture. It's a shame about the old craftsmanship dying out, the senator said, cutting into his steak. You don't see passion in design anymore. Everyone just wants glass boxes. Passion doesn't pay the bills, Marcus laughed, swirling his wine. Vision requires capital. Architects are dreamers. Developers are the ones who actually build the world. Elena felt a sudden, sharp pang in her chest. She thought of Ethan. She remembered late nights where he would wake her up, eyes shining, to show her a sketch of a cornice or a light well, talking about how light could change a person's mood. He had been a dreamer, yes, but he had looked at her like she was the sun that lit his world. Marcus didn't look at her. He looked past her, scanning the room for someone more important. Later that night, back in the silent, cold apartment, Elena sat on the edge of the bed while Marcus took a call in his study. The silence of the apartment was different now. It wasn't peaceful. It was vacuous. She picked up her phone. For the 100th time in 6 months, she typed Ethan Caldwell into the search bar. Nothing. No LinkedIn updates, no Facebook profile, no Instagram. His digital footprint had simply ceased to exist the day he left. It was as if he had fallen off the edge of the earth. She had expected him to beg. She had prepared herself for drunk texts, for angry letters, for something. But he had given her exactly what she asked for, his absence, and it was driving her mad. His silence was a mirror reflecting her own cruelty back at her. Marcus walked into the bedroom, tossing his phone onto the nightstand. Great news, he said, unbuttoning his shirt. The senator is on board. We're going to tear down that block in Queens. Marcus, Elena said softly, do you ever wonder where he went? Who? Marcus asked, distracted, looking at himself in the mirror. Ethan. Marcus paused, then let out a short, incredulous scoff. The ex? Why on earth would I think about him? He was a loser, Elena. He couldn't keep up with you, and he certainly couldn't keep up with this city. He's probably in Ohio teaching drafting at a community college. He climbed into bed and turned off his lamp, plunging his side of the room into darkness. Come to bed, he muttered. I have an early tea time. Elena lay down next to him. The sheets were cold. She stared at the ceiling, at the smooth, flawless plaster where Ethan had once pointed out a hairline crack he wanted to fix. The crack was gone. Everything was perfect. Everything was expensive. She turned on her side, facing away from the man who had bought her this life. A single tear leaked out, sliding hot across the bridge of her nose. She was living in a penthouse at the top of the world, and she had never felt more like a tenant in her own life. The heat in Dubai was not like the heat in New York. It was not a humid blanket. It was a physical weight, a hammer that struck the earth from a white-hot sky. Ethan stood on the skeletal steel frame of the Al Mirage Tower, 40 stories above the shifting sands. The wind whipped his safety vest against his chest, but he didn't flinch. In his hand, he held the blueprints that the previous lead architect had claimed were impossible to build. Ethan had redesigned the load-bearing structure in 3 nights, fueled by black coffee and a refusal to sleep. Sleep was where the memories lived. Work was the only safe place. Mr. Caldwell, the site foreman, shouted over the wind. The crew is exhausted. It's 110 degrees. They need a break. Ethan turned. His skin was tanned dark, leathery from exposure. He had lost 20 pounds of softness and gained a wire-taut layer of muscle. His eyes, once warm and expressive, were now hidden behind mirrored aviators. The deadline is immovable, Ethan said, his voice grating like gravel. Rotate the shifts, double the water ration. But the cranes do not stop moving. If we lose a day, we lose the contract. He didn't offer sympathy. He didn't ask about their families. He had learned quickly that in this world, empathy was a structural weakness. It was a crack in the foundation that would eventually bring the whole building down. 2 years bled into 3. The desert of Dubai gave way to the humid, neon-lit density of Singapore. Ethan moved from the construction site to the boardroom, but he brought the dust with him. He became known as the fixer, the man brought in when a project was failing, over budget, or drowning in red tape. He didn't design homes anymore. He didn't care about light or flow, or the way a family would gather in a kitchen. He cared about yield, square footage, and air rights. He stopped going by Ethan. To the investors in Hong Kong and the bankers in London, he was simply Caldwell. In a glass-walled conference room overlooking Marina Bay, Caldwell sat opposite a group of nervous investors. They were trying to save a historic theater from demolition. They spoke passionately about heritage, about art, about the soul of the city. Caldwell listened, spinning a heavy fountain pen between his fingers. He remembered a man who used to talk like that, a man who loved crown moldings and history. He had killed that man somewhere between Jumeirah and Changi Airport. The soul of the city doesn't pay dividends, Caldwell said, cutting off the lead investor. He slid a folder across the table. This is my offer. It's generous. We keep the factum, gut the interior, and build 40 units of luxury residential above it. Take it or I buy the debt from your bank tomorrow and foreclose. The room went silent. They looked at him with fear. He recognized the look. It was the look of prey realizing they were in a cage with a predator. They signed the papers. By the 5th year, the transformation was complete. Caldwell stood in the penthouse suite of a hotel he now owned, looking out at the Singapore Strait. It was night and the ships were lit up like a floating city. His phone buzzed on the glass table. It was his private banker in Zurich. The acquisition fund is fully capitalized, sir, the banker said. The shell companies are established. We are ready to move into the North American market. Do you have a target city? Caldwell didn't answer immediately. He walked to the window, his reflection staring back at him. The man in the glass wore a bespoke suit that cost more than his father's house. His hair was cut short, military style. His face was a mask of sharp angles. He thought of New York, not with longing, but with the cold calculation of a general looking at a map. He thought of the brownstones, the pre-war cooperatives, the buildings that people clung to like life rafts. He thought of a specific building on the Upper West Side. New York, Caldwell said softly. I want to buy New York. Any specific portfolio? Distressed assets, Caldwell said. Historic properties with management issues. And start with the West Side. I want to buy the debt on residential buildings. Understood. We begin tomorrow. Caldwell hung up. He poured himself a glass of water. He didn't drink alcohol anymore. It dulled the edge, and looked at the horizon. He had spent 5 years building skyscrapers in the sand, proving he could create something from nothing. Now he was ready for the second phase of his architecture. He wasn't going back to build. He was going back to dismantle. He was coming home. Karma did not arrive with a bang. It arrived on a Tuesday evening via a courier service, followed by the soft, indifferent clicking of luxury luggage wheels. Elena stood in the center of the living room, the same room where she had ended her marriage 5 years ago. The space was still impeccable, a showroom of white marble and chrome, but the air felt thin, as if the oxygen was being siphoned out. Marcus was not sitting in the wingback chair. He was standing by the door, checking his reflection in the hallway mirror, adjusting his cufflinks. He looked younger than he had 5 years ago, thanks to better dermatology and a younger personal trainer. The movers will come for the rest of the art on Thursday, Marcus said, his tone casual, as if he were discussing a dinner reservation. You can keep the furniture. It doesn't fit the aesthetic of the new place. Elena's hands were trembling. She clasped them together to hide the vibration. The new place? She repeated, her voice brittle. You bought the penthouse at 432 Park without telling me? Marcus finally turned to look at her. His expression was one of mild pity, mixed with the boredom of a man who had already mentally left the room months ago. I bought it with Sophia, he said. Sophia, his 24-year-old executive assistant, the one Elena had hired, the one Elena had trained. She's a child, Marcus. Elena spat, the venom finally breaking through her composure. She doesn't know the first thing about your world. She's an accessory. She's uncomplicated, Marcus corrected, his voice hardening. And she doesn't treat every dinner party like a networking merger. You're exhaustive, Elena. You're always working. It's like sleeping with a LinkedIn profile. The insult landed like a physical blow. Elena took a step back. She had curated herself for him. She had erased the softness, the artistic whimsy, the parts of herself that Ethan had loved, all to become the power couple he wanted. And now he was discarding her for being exactly what he had molded. I put 5 years into this, she whispered. I built your brand. I managed your crises. And you were paid well for it, Marcus said, glancing at the apartment. I'm not leaving you destitute. The lease on this place is in your name, remember? You wanted the prestige of being the primary tenant on the board application. So it's yours. The blood drained from Elena's face. The apartment, the Upper West Side pre-war gem. The rent had skyrocketed in the last 3 years. Marcus had been paying it from his private account. I can't afford the rent on this place alone, she said, panic rising in her throat. Not with the agency's numbers down this quarter. Marcus shrugged. It was a gesture of supreme indifference. Then move, downsize, get a place in Brooklyn. I hear it's gentrifying nicely. He opened the door. The hallway light spilled in, harsh and exposing. Goodbye, Elena, he said. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't look back. He simply walked out, the heavy door clicking shut with that same finality she knew so well. Elena stood alone in the silence. She looked around the sprawling apartment. It was massive, cold, and echoing. It cost $12,000 a month just to keep the lights on and the lease active. Her PR firm was struggling. Clients were moving to younger, digital-first agencies. She was 37, single, and standing in a mausoleum of her own ambition. Move, he had said. Go to Brooklyn. The thought made her nauseous. To leave this building was to admit defeat. To leave meant that the neighbors would whisper, that her friends would know she had been discarded. If she lost this address, she was just a divorced, middle-aged woman who had thrown away a good husband for a lottery ticket that didn't pay out. No, she couldn't leave. She walked over to the window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Ethan was gone, erased. Somewhere out there, Marcus was popping champagne with a girl who hadn't been born when Elena graduated college. She gripped the velvet curtains. She would keep the apartment. She would fire her assistant. She would sell the jewelry. She would take on the humiliating low-budget clients she usually turned away. She would bleed herself dry before she let them see her pack a box. This apartment was her armor. Without it, she was nothing. I am not leaving, she whispered to the empty room. She didn't know that miles away, across the ocean, a signature had just been inked on a document that would turn her sanctuary into a battlefield. She didn't know that the building she was fighting to keep had just been sold to a ghost. New York City did not welcome Ethan Caldwell back with a parade. It welcomed him with a biting February wind and a sky the color of bruised iron. But this time, the cold didn't matter. Ethan stepped off the private Gulfstream jet at Teterboro Airport. A black SUV was waiting on the tarmac, engine idling. The driver, a man with a thick neck and professional silence, opened the door. Ethan slid into the leather interior, the climate control set to a precise 70 degrees. He looked out the tinted window as the car merged onto the highway toward Manhattan. The skyline rose up like a jagged graph of ambition. 5 years ago, those buildings had looked like insurmountable cliffs. Now, they looked like inventory. Take me to the office first, Ethan said. Hudson Yards. Yes, sir. Caldwell Holdings had leased the 45th floor of a new glass needle overlooking the Hudson River. The office was stark, monochromatic, and terrifyingly quiet. It was staffed by analysts who spoke in hushed tones and lawyers who billed in 6-minute increments. They knew him only as the chairman. They didn't know he used to eat Dollar Slice on 6th Avenue to save money for drafting paper. Ethan stood by the window of his corner office, looking south. He had spent the last 5 years in deserts and tropical humidities, building things that defied nature. But this concrete jungle was where he had been forged. The portfolio is finalized, sir, his chief of operations, a sharp woman named Sarah said from the doorway. She held a tablet. We've acquired the distress notes on 3 commercial properties in Soho and the residential block on the Upper West Side. The management transfer happens at midnight. The Upper West Side property, Ethan said, not turning around. The pre-war on 81st Street. Is the paperwork clean? It's messy, but it's ours. The previous holding company was leveraging it against bad debt. We own the building, the land, and the leases. We have full right to restructure rents to market rates immediately. Good, Ethan said. Leave the file. When she left, Ethan walked over to the desk and opened the digital file. He scrolled past the financial spreadsheets, past the structural assessments, until he reached the tenant roll. He scanned the names. Apartment 3B, Elena Ross. The name looked small on the screen. Harmless, just pixels. But seeing it made his pulse spike. A singular violent thud against his ribs. She was still there. She was still clinging to the wreckage. Driver, Ethan spoke into the intercom on his desk. Bring the car around. I want to see the asset. An hour later, the black SUV pulled up to the curb on West 81st Street. It was snowing lightly, the flakes dissolving on the windshield. Ethan didn't get out. He pressed the button to lower the window just an inch, letting the sounds of the street filter in, the distant sirens, the hiss of tires on wet asphalt. He looked up at the building. It was a beautiful structure, limestone and brick, with gargoyles perched on the eaves. He remembered the day they had moved in. He remembered carrying a box of books up the stairs because the elevator was broken, laughing with Elena, thinking they had conquered the world. Now he saw the cracks in the masonry that needed pointing. He saw the outdated single-pane windows that leaked heat. He saw an inefficient heating system venting steam into the night. He saw flaws. He saw leverage. His eyes drifted to the 3rd floor. The lights were on. The curtains, heavy, velvet, expensive, were drawn, but a silhouette moved behind them. He wondered if she was drinking wine. He wondered if she was waiting for someone. He wondered if she ever looked at the spot on the floor where she had placed his suitcase and felt a phantom draft. A couple walked past his car, huddled together under an umbrella, laughing. They looked young, broke, and in love. Ethan felt a strange phantom pain, like an amputated limb. He was richer than God, but he couldn't remember the last time he had laughed like that. He pressed the button. The window rolled up, sealing him back inside his silence. We own it, Ethan whispered to the dark interior of the car. He wasn't just talking about the brick and mortar. He was talking about the sanctuary she had chosen over him. He was the landlord of her life now, and she didn't even know he was in the same hemisphere. Back to the hotel, he ordered. The car pulled away, sliding seamlessly into the traffic, a shark disappearing into the deep water, leaving the building and its unsuspecting tenants standing on ground that was already shifting beneath their feet. The meeting was held behind a closed, soundproof door on the 45th floor. No windows were allowed in the room. The focus was meant to be purely internal, divorced from the distractions of the city below. Ethan, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked sculpted onto his frame, sat at the head of a 12-foot conference table. Opposite him sat his chief legal counsel, Victor, a man whose entire philosophy was contained in the phrase, aggressive but compliant with all applicable statutes. The title transfer for 81st Street is complete, Victor confirmed, sliding a dense legal folder across the polished surface. The new management company, Veritas Holdings, is officially in place as of 0001 this morning. We are now their landlord. And the mandate? Ethan asked. His voice was level, almost bored, though his inner architect was tracing every curve of the building in his mind. Phase 1 is to establish financial urgency, Victor explained, tapping the folder. We are issuing notices of intent for 2 major actions. First, a 50% increase on all non-rent controlled units, effective in 90 days. Second, a mandatory capital improvement assessment for all cooperative owners, retrofitting the entire building for energy efficiency. We estimate the cost per unit to be significant. Ethan leaned back. Significant meaning? Meaning $30,000 to $50,000 depending on the unit size. Victor said, a slight grin touching his lips. It's perfectly legal, of course. Necessary infrastructure upgrades, but it will require immediate cash reserves from the tenants, the low reserves tenants, those living paycheck to paycheck on lifestyle, will be forced to sell their shares back to Veritas at a discounted rate. Ethan knew, without asking, who the primary target of that pressure would be. Elena had never been good with finances, and Chapter 5 had confirmed she was struggling to maintain the lifestyle Marcus had abandoned her with. The $50,000 assessment would be a nuclear strike against her strained budget. The notices must be boilerplate, Ethan instructed, his gaze fixed on the precise geometry of the table corner. No personal contact. All correspondence runs through your law firm. I want a wall of bureaucracy between the tenants and Veritas Holdings. We are an algorithm, not a person. Understood, Chairman. Total anonymity, Victor affirmed. What about the long-term plan for the building? Total conversion, Ethan stated, the finality in his voice chilling. Gut the apartments, combine units, install modern systems. We convert it from a residential property into a high-end commercial residential hybrid. The residential tenants are just temporary occupants. Victor nodded, making a note. A total restructuring. We'll need a path to no-fault eviction for the current leaseholders who can't meet the new capital requirements. Make that the focus of Phase 2, Ethan instructed, and prioritize the third-floor units. They have superior light exposure for commercial zoning. The lie was smooth. Superior light exposure was irrelevant. It was simply the floor where apartment 3B was located. He reached for the printout of the tenant roll, his hand briefly covering the name Elena Ross. He saw her not as a woman, but as a liability, a single distressed asset that needed to be liquidated to make the portfolio profitable. It felt clean. It felt distant. It felt like the perfect revenge, not a dramatic emotional scream, but a cold, calculated financial death. He was not beating her in a fight. He was dissolving her life with paper and debt. Execute Phase 1 at the end of business today, Ethan commanded. I want those notices postmarked this evening. Victor gathered his papers and left. The heavy door swung shut, leaving Ethan alone in the sterile silence. He stood up and walked to the wall where a massive digital map of Manhattan glowed. A small, anonymous red dot pulsed on the Upper West Side. 81st Street. He had spent 5 years running from the pain she inflicted. Now he was applying that same pain to her through the mechanism of law and property. He was finally home. The envelope was thick, heavy, and cream-colored. It did not look like a threat. It looked like an invitation to a gala. Elena found it in her mailbox on a Wednesday morning, wedged between a flyer for a takeout sushi place and a utility bill she had already deferred twice. She carried the mail upstairs, her heels clicking on the marble steps of the lobby, marble that was now, legally, the property of Veritas Holdings. She entered apartment 3B, tossing her keys into the crystal bowl by the door. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. Since Marcus had left, the silence had developed a texture, a kind of heavy grain that settled on the furniture like dust. She poured a glass of sparkling water and sat at the kitchen island. She picked up the heavy envelope. The return address was a post office box in Delaware, listed simply as Veritas Holdings, LLC. She slid her finger under the flap and tore it open. Inside was a single document, printed on high-quality bond paper, stapled to an invoice. The language was dense, legal, and devoid of humanity. Notice of mandatory capital improvement assessment and rent adjustment. Dear tenant, pursuant to the acquisition of the property at address redacted by Veritas Holdings, and in accordance with New York City housing codes regarding structural integrity and energy efficiency, a mandatory retrofitting of the building's HVAC and electrical systems will commence on March 1st. As a shareholder/leaseholder, your portion of the assessment is calculated based on square footage. Elena's eyes skipped over the paragraph citing statutes and bylaws. She hunted for the number. She found it at the bottom of the page, bolded. Total assessment due, 60 days, $48,500 monthly rent adjustment, effective immediately, plus 45%. Elena stopped breathing. The glass of water slipped from her hands, shattering on the tile floor. She didn't flinch. She didn't look down. She just stared at the number. $48,000. She opened her banking app on her phone with trembling fingers. She refreshed the balance, praying for a miracle, for a forgotten deposit. Available balance, 4,232 A wave of nausea rolled over her. She was drowning. The PR agency was barely breaking even. She had lost the Sterling account when Marcus left, and 3 other clients had followed him. She was living on credit cards and the fumes of her reputation. "They can't do this," she whispered. Her voice sounded small in the high-ceilinged room. "This is illegal." Panic began to claw at her throat, but then the old reflex kicked in. The survival instinct that had gotten her from a middle-class suburb to the Upper West Side. She wasn't a victim, she was a strategist. She fixed problems. She spun narratives. She grabbed her phone and dialed the number of Jessica Vance, a senior editor at the City Chronicle, and an old drinking buddy from her golden years. "Elena," Jessica's voice was rushed, the sound of a newsroom in the background. "I'm on deadline, what's up?" "I have a story for you, Jess," Elena said, her voice sharpening, finding its professional cadence. "A predatory real estate story. A faceless shell company just bought a historic building on the west side and is trying to illegal evict tenants with bogus assessments. They're bullying widows and single women." She paused, waiting for the outrage. "Elena," Jessica sighed, "is this about your building?" "It's about justice," Elena snapped, pacing the kitchen, stepping over the broken glass. "They want 50 grand in 60 days. It's a constructive eviction. If you run an expose shaming them, they'll back off. Bad press kills these equity firms." "Send me the notice," Jessica said, her tone guarded. "But I have to be honest, Elena. This is happening all over the city. Unless there's a specific violation, it's just real estate. And these new firms, they don't care about bad press. They don't have a face to shame." "Just run the damn story," Elena said, her voice cracking. "Please, I can't move, Jess. This is my home." "Send it over," Jessica said softly. "I'll see what I can do." Elena hung up. She stood in the middle of the kitchen, surrounded by the shards of her broken glass. She felt a cold draft coming from the window, a chill that seemed to seep into her bones. She looked at the letter again. Veritas Holdings. Truth Holdings. She didn't know who was behind the name. She imagined a board of old men in gray suits, smoking cigars, looking at spreadsheets. She didn't know that the man behind the letter was the same man who had once installed the very tile she was standing on, the man whose heart she had broken in this very room. She thought she was fighting a corporation. She didn't realize she was fighting a ghost. Elena knelt down and began to pick up the pieces of glass with her bare hands, ignoring the sting as a shard sliced her thumb. She needed the pain. It was the only thing that felt real. The article ran on page 14 of the City Chronicle, buried under a story about subway delays and a review of a new fusion restaurant in Soho. Elena stared at the newsprint, her coffee going cold in the ceramic mug. The headline she had pitched was "Predatory Landlords Attack Historic West Side." The headline that ran was "Upper West Side Co-op Board Implements Modernization Fees. Tenants Protest." It wasn't a war cry. It was a murmur. She refreshed her email, waiting for the influx of support, the outraged tweets, the call from Veritas Holdings begging for a truce to stop the bad press. There was nothing. Jessica had texted her earlier, "Sorry, Elena." The legal team watered it down. They said Veritas is within their rights. It's a standard capital improvement. No scandal here. Elena dropped the phone onto the granite counter. The silence in the apartment was deafening. She had thrown her best punch, her reputation, her connections, her ability to spin a narrative, and it had hit a wall of reinforced concrete. Veritas Holdings didn't care about public opinion. They were an algorithm. They were a spreadsheet. You couldn't shame a spreadsheet. The deadline for the first installment of the assessment was 48 hours away. She walked into her bedroom. The walk-in closet was a shrine to the woman she had become. Rows of Louboutins, shelves of Hermès bags, racks of silk and cashmere. It was a collection worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, curated to prove to the world that she had made it. Now it just looked like inventory. Elena grabbed a large duffel bag from the top shelf. She began to pull things down. The Birkin bag Marcus had bought her for their first anniversary. The diamond tennis bracelet he had given her when she landed the TechCorp account. The vintage Chanel jacket she had bought to celebrate moving into this apartment. She packed them with a frantic, jerky energy, her breath coming in short gasps. She wasn't just packing clothes, she was cannibalizing her identity. Every item going into the bag was a memory of a time she felt powerful. Now they were just currency to buy her another month of survival. 2 hours later, she sat in a private office at Goldman & Sons Auctioneers on Madison Avenue. The room smelled of old paper and desperation masked by polite tea service. The appraiser, a man with a looped monocle and soft, pitying hands, examined the diamond bracelet. "It's exquisite, Ms. Ross," he said softly. "But the market for secondary luxury goods is soft right now, and with the provenance is fine," Elena snapped, her leg bouncing nervously under the table. "It was a gift from Marcus Sterling." "I understand," the appraiser said, removing his loop. "But without the original receipt and given the urgency of the sale, I can offer you $18,000. "It was insured for $40," Elena said, her voice rising. "That's robbery." "It's liquidity," the man corrected gently. "Do you want the check today?" Elena looked at the bracelet. It glittered under the harsh halogen lights. It represented the peak of her life with Marcus, the moment she thought she had won. Now it was just cold metal and carbon. "Take it," she whispered. She left the auction house with a check in a hollow space in her chest. She went to 3 more consignment shops, selling the bags, the shoes, the silk scarves. By 4 p.m., she had raised $32,000. It was enough to cover the first installment of the assessment, with a little left over for groceries. She walked to the bank to deposit the checks. As she stood in line, she saw her reflection in the security glass. She looked thinner. Her coat, the one she hadn't sold, loosely on her frame. She looked like a woman holding onto a ledge by her fingernails. She made the transfer to Veritas Holdings, LLC. As the teller stamped the receipt, Elena felt a strange, sick sense of victory. She had done it. She had paid the ransom. She had bought herself time. She walked back out into the gray afternoon. Her phone buzzed. It was an automated email from the building management portal. "Payment received. Thank you. Please note, Phase 2 of the renovation begins next month. Access to the third-floor terrace will be restricted for structural reinforcement. Noise levels may be significant between 7:02 a.m. and 6:00 p.m. Elena stopped on the sidewalk. Phase 2. She had sold her past to pay for Phase 1. What would she sell for Phase 2? She looked up at the sky, feeling the weight of the city pressing down on her. She realized then that this wasn't a battle she could win with a single check. This was a siege. They weren't trying to evict her immediately. They were trying to starve her out. And for the first time, standing there with an empty duffel bag and a receipt in her pocket, she wondered if the apartment was worth dying for. But then she thought of Ethan. She thought of how he had left with nothing. If she left now, she would be just like him. A failure. A discard. "No," she whispered, gripping the handle of the bag. "I'm staying." She turned and walked toward the subway, head down, preparing for the next wave, unaware that the tide was controlled by a man watching her from 45 stories up. The drilling began at 7 a.m. sharp. It was a rhythmic, grinding vibration that traveled up the steel columns of the building and settled directly into the base of Elena's skull. For 3 weeks, the renovations had turned the building into a war zone. The lobby was draped in plastic sheeting. The elevator was permanently out of service for maintenance, forcing Elena to walk up 3 flights of stairs in heels, carrying groceries she could barely afford. She sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by legal paperwork. The second assessment notice had arrived yesterday, another $20,000. This time, there was no jewelry left to sell. "There has to be a mistake," she muttered, her eyes scanning the fine print of the building code. She had hired a lawyer, not a shark like the ones she used to retain for her firm, but a strip mall attorney in Queens named Mr. Gorski, who specialized in tenant harassment. He was cheap, cynical, and smelled faintly of tobacco, but he was the only one who would take the case on a contingency basis. Her phone rang. It was Gorski. "Ms. Ross," his voice scratched over the line. "I've been digging into the LLC chain for Veritas Holdings. It's a maze. Delaware shells nested inside Cayman trusts. Standard corporate camouflage. So we can't sue them? Elena asked, pressing her hand against her forehead to block out the sound of the jackhammers downstairs. Well, that's the thing, Gorski said. To file the injunction for harassment, I needed to serve the actual principal owner, not just the registered agent. I called in a favor with a clerk at the city registrar. We found the guarantor for the mortgage note. Who is it? Elena asked. Is it BlackRock? Some hedge fund? No, Gorski said. It's a single entity, Caldwell Global Architecture and Development. The name hung in the air, suspended in the dust motes dancing in the morning light. Elena felt her heart stop. It was a physical sensation, a hard thump followed by a terrifying silence. Caldwell? She whispered. Yeah, big international firm based out of Singapore and Dubai. Just moved their HQ to Hudson Yards. You know them? Elena didn't answer. She dropped the phone to the table, not bothering to hang up. Her hands were shaking so violently, she had to grip the edge of the counter to keep from falling. Caldwell. It was a common name. There were thousands of Caldwells. It couldn't be. Ethan was a residential architect who struggled to pay for subway fare. Ethan was a romantic who sketched crown moldings on napkins. He wasn't a global development entity. He wasn't a guarantor of multi-million-dollar mortgages. She grabbed her laptop. Her fingers fumbled over the keys as she typed, Caldwell Global Architecture CEO. The search results loaded instantly. The first image was a high-resolution headshot from Forbes. The headline read, The Architect of Ruins, How Ethan Caldwell Built an Empire on Distressed Assets. Elena stared at the screen. It was him. But it wasn't him. The man in the photo wore a suit that cost more than her car. His hair was shorter, graying at the temples. His jawline was harder, set in an expression of absolute unyielding authority. But the eyes, cold, dark, and intelligent, were the same eyes that had watched her pack his bags 5 years ago. She clicked on the article, known for his ruthless efficiency and his philosophy that emotional attachment is the enemy of structure. Caldwell has recently returned to New York to acquire a portfolio of historic properties. Elena backed away from the laptop as if it were radioactive. She bumped into the island, gasping for air. It wasn't a coincidence, the acquisition, the rent hikes, the specific pressure on the third floor, the relentless, suffocating bureaucracy. He knew. He knew she was here. He had bought the building because she was here. A wave of vertigo washed over her. She realized with a sick, dawning horror that she hadn't been fighting a faceless corporation. She had been fighting Ethan, and he hadn't said a word. He hadn't sent a text. He hadn't yelled at her. He had simply used his checkbook to construct a cage around her, bar by bar, fee by fee. The drilling downstairs intensified, a loud, grinding roar that shook the floorboards. Elena covered her mouth to stifle a scream. The noise wasn't just construction. It was him. It was Ethan, tearing down the world she had stolen from him, dismantling her life from the foundation up. She looked at the apartment, the walls she had fought to keep, the address she had clung to as a status symbol. It wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was a trap. And the man holding the key was the man she had thrown out into the rain. She was no longer the protagonist of her own life. She was just a tenant in his. The appointment was scheduled for 10 o'clock a.m. Ethan arrived at 9:59. He didn't come alone. He was flanked by Victor, his legal counsel, and a structural engineer holding a laser measuring tool. They moved through the hallway with the efficiency of a surgical team entering an operating theater. Inside apartment 3B, Elena was waiting. She had spent 2 hours getting ready. She wasn't wearing the desperate, casual clothes of a struggling freelancer. She wore a cream cashmere sweater and tailored trousers, soft, elegant, reminiscent of the wife he used to sketch on Sunday mornings. She had arranged fresh flowers on the console table, a pathetic attempt to mask the smell of stale anxiety and the dust from the hallway construction. When the knock came, she didn't just open the door. She composed herself, pulling her shoulders back, summoning every ounce of the PR executive she used to be. She opened the door. Ethan stood there. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps just straighter. The slump of the overworked dreamer was gone. In its place was the rigid posture of a man who owned the ground he stood on. He wore a navy suit, bespoke, the fabric absorbing the light. Good morning, Ms. Ross, Ethan said. His voice was a shock. It wasn't the voice of her husband. It was deep, resonant, and utterly devoid of warmth. He didn't say Elena. He said Ms. Ross. Ethan, she breathed, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. Mr. Caldwell, Victor corrected smoothly, stepping forward. We are here for the scheduled structural assessment of Unit 3B regarding the load-bearing modifications for the commercial conversion. Ethan didn't look at her. He stepped past her into the foyer, his eyes scanning the ceiling molding. Check the lintels on the north wall, Ethan said to the engineer, pointing a gloved hand. I suspect moisture damage from the untreated brickwork. Elena stood by the door, frozen. He was ignoring her. He was walking through their old living room, the room where they had danced, where they had fought, where she had ended their marriage, and he was treating it like a raw construction site. Ethan, please, she said, closing the door and shutting out the hallway noise. She walked toward him. Can we just talk? Without the lawyers? Ethan turned slowly. He looked at Victor. Give us a moment. Check the bedroom plumbing. Victor and the engineer disappeared down the hall. For the first time in 7 years, they were alone. Elena took a step closer. She saw the gray in his beard, the lines around his eyes. She searched for a flicker of pain, of anger, of love. She found nothing. His face was a calm, frozen lake. I know it's you, she said, her voice gaining a little strength. I know you bought the building. I know you're forcing me out. I bought a distressed asset, Ethan said calmly, checking his watch. The tenant list was incidental. Incidental? Elena let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. You're evicting me, Ethan. You're ruining me. You think I don't know? This is revenge? For Marcus? For how I ended it? Ethan looked at her then, really looked at her. His gaze wasn't angry, it was inquisitive, detached. You overestimate your importance in my portfolio, Elena, he said. This building is an investment. It's underperforming. You are a tenant in a rent-stabilized unit that doesn't generate yield. It's simple math. It's not math, she cried, tears finally spilling over. It's our life. We lived here. You loved me here. Doesn't that mean anything to you? I am drowning, Ethan. I have nothing left. Marcus left me. My company is failing. This apartment is all I have. She reached out, grabbing his arm. The wool of his suit was soft under her fingers. I made a mistake, she whispered, looking up at him. I know I hurt you. I was ambitious and stupid and I hurt you. But you can't just throw me on the street. You're not that cruel. You're still the man who built me a bookshelf because I ran out of space. I know you are. Ethan looked down at her hand on his arm. He didn't pull away violently. He simply removed her hand with his own, lifting it off his sleeve as if it were a piece of lint. That man couldn't afford the rent in this city, Ethan said softly. So I killed him. Elena recoiled as if he had slapped her. You want closure, Elena? Ethan asked, his voice dropping, intimate but terrifying. Here it is. I don't hate you. I don't love you. I don't think about you when I wake up. I don't think about you when I go to sleep. You are just an occupant in square footage I need to repurpose. He stepped back, adjusting his cuff. The eviction notice stands. You have 48 hours to vacate. If you are not out, the marshals will remove your property. And frankly, looking at this furniture, it's not worth the moving cost. Victor and the engineer returned from the hallway. Plumbing is shot, the engineer reported. Needs a full gut. Schedule the demolition crew for Monday, Ethan said. He turned and walked toward the door. He didn't look back at the woman sobbing silently in the middle of the room. He didn't pause at the threshold. He walked out, and for the second time in their lives, he closed the door between them. But this time, he was on the outside, free, and she was on the inside, trapped in a room that no longer belonged to her.